Te hei mauri ora kia tātou. Te hei uri uri, te hei noko noko kātou. Kātou haha te rangi e tū nei. Kātou haha te papa e hora nei. Kātou, te mātuku mai rorotonga. Ko ia i ruku hia manawa pau roto. Ko ia i ruku hia manawa pau waho. Whakatīna kia tīna. Tīna. Te more, i tipu mai Hawaii ki. He pupu ana hoki, he wāwā ana hoki. Tārewa tū ki te rangi aua kia eke. Kia eke tanuku, kia eke tangaroa. Pāno, patua mai te toke, haumi e, hui e, taiki. He runga tonu e ngā tīmatanga kōrero ko ngā patu e huri nei ki te runga rawa. A koe a tonu kei te api kei te manaki a tātou, me whakahonore, me whakakrōria ko tōna ingoa tapu. He, tū wake anā urunga i te tihi o mawa o kā ti tiro ki tua. Nei rā ngā puke maunga e pīkau mai ana. Ara awata ne wainuku, ara a pū whenua. He, titiro atu ki rota i te rohe o tainui waka. Ko maunga tautari tērā ko te awa wai katoa re ana ki taupiri maunga. E mihi nei ki tō tātou kingi Māori a kingi tūhei kia pōta tau te wherawhero te tuawhitu. E noho nei runga i te hurewa tapu ona mātua ona tūpuna. Me tōna haranga tira ata whai. I roto i te whare o pōta tau. Me ki ake kia rātou. Ririre hau. Pai marire kia rātou. Hoki nei ki te wā hingaro. Rātou katoa ko huri te kanuhi. E hoki nei ki te wā kāinga. Nei rā te karanga kia rātou. Haere hoki atu. Hoki atu ki te nuinga o te whānau e tatari mai nei tui te arai. Waiho tiana ko tāta nei kei muri. E tangi nei, e mihi nei, e tangi nei. Tahi noi o te koro mō rātou. Kia rātou katoa ko huri te kanuhi ki tō tātou matu e nui tō te rangi. Mana nei hei arataki a rātou. I roto i te reo o ngā wairua me ki ake haere kia mau ki roto i ngā ringa o te atua. Nei rai runga i te kaupapa o te rā. E ngā mātā waka kei wangani a tātou. Ngā kā rangarangatanga o te moana o tauranga, putanua ki waho, ki runga i te motu. Mai te hiku o te ika ki te upoko. Whakawhiti atu te moana o raukawa ki te wai paunamu, ki raki ura, i ngā mautere katoa te moana nui a kiwa, kia koutou katoa, nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai. Whakatau mai ki roto i te moana o tauranga. Nei ranga karanga iwi kia koutou, ko ngā tipu kenga, ko ngā e te rangi, ko ngā tirangi nui, e mihi nei kia koutou i tēnei ahi pō. Nei rā, i ruka i roto i ngā whiringa koro o te ahi nei. I runga i te pō whakahira, ko taunga, anei te karanga kei runga i a hau. Mō ngā reo e toru, e hoki nei ngā whakaro, ki ngā tau ki muri, i e rua ngā rautau, i te wā, i tukuna mai, te tuhinga mō te tiriti o Waitangi, nei ra ko tātou tēnei. Nō reira, whakahuri ake o tātou taringa ki a rātou. Kia whakarongo ki o rātou whakaro. Ngā hua kei roto o rātou whakaro. I te mutunga ka puta mai, mā tātou ata whiriwhiri, kia kimihia te hua, hei pai ake mō tātou. I te mutunga, ko te oranga, ko tātou tamariki mokopuna. Nei rei mihi nei kia koutou e kuranga tira, ko tā mai tēnei ahi pō, mō tātou katoa. Kia tau te inga mātau a te atua ki runga a tātou. Nei rā, tō mātau karakia hei tīmata, tō tātou mahi kaupapa o tēnei pō. Hoena ko te mea nui e mihi nei ki a tātou, ko tau mai. Tēnā koutou, a kia ora tātou katoa. Anei tō tātou karakia. He tō mātau matu nui o te rangi ki a tapu anō tō ingoa. Nei rā mātau ka tau mai i tēnei ahi pō. E hoki nei ngā whakaaro ki ngā tau ki muri. I ngā wā i tau mai, te kiri mā ki roto, ki runga i tēnei mautere o Aotearoa. Nei rā, mā mātou tēneki, e ata runga, e ata whakarungo ki ngā koro ka puta mai, i runga i ngā whakaro e pāna ki ngā tokotoru, kei te koro ki a mātou i tēnei ahi pō. Manaki ki a tātou e mātou katoa, kia tau ko te humārie me te rangi mārie, me tō wairua tapu hei awhi he manaki i a tātou katoa. Tā pūnui ko te atua nui a tūmatau ngā kahukura nui te pō. Ko maui nui o maui taha, maui roto, maui pai, maui tiki a tāranga. Tēnā tapu nu I tapu ro, kia whakahoki atu ngā whaituanga huru ki Hawaii ki. Kei reira ngā pū, ngā weo, ngā wala, ngā tohunga I tipua mai te Māori. I te Māori nui, te Māori ro, te Māori kia whakaai, kia whakaputātu ki te whai au, ki te ao marama. I runga I te matua, te tama me te wairua tapu tūturu whakamaua kia tīna. Haumi e hui e. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you very much, e te kai karakia, matua tamati, e te kai mihi mai kia mātou. Thank you very much for blessing our time together this evening with your prayer and with your welcome. People of Tauranga, how good it is to gather with you all this Monday. I certainly add my voice to matua tamati's, my voice of welcome to this evening, to gather, to hear the conversation between the three voices at the treaty table. To the hosts of our time here together, Social Link, Priority One and Te Kohinga, thank you. Thank you very much for hosting us. Kia ora to you all. As for me, my name is Lillian Murray, and I'm the friendly figure that will usher us through this evening. As a point of connection, I'd love to share with you that my dear ancestors are from England, from Alabama, Scotland, from Ireland and from Wales. I was born in Tauranga Hospital. For the first 2 years of my life, I was raised in Papamoa, and then spent my childhood and my young womanhood nurtured by the neighbourhood of Te Puke. So kia ora. I'm now a teacher. And if you'll forgive me being just really teachery for a moment, I'd actually love to just overtly state the learning intention of tonight. Don't feel patronised, but just to really, name the starting position and some of the assumptions that some of the speakers are coming from tonight. And so here it is. Our objective is that because of the voices that we hear this evening, we would all be upskilled to engage well in the public conversation, in the public discourse around some really important issues. For example, Three Waters. For example, co-governance. For example, the changing of the way we do the heart of the city in Tauranga. Now, our aim is not even that the conversation would start to lean a little bit this way or start to lean a little bit that way. No, we all come with our biases, but that isn't the heart of this evening. Instead, our starting position is that the basic foundation that underlies these important issues is Ti Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, and the differing perspectives on that document. That is to say, the treaty informs some of the policy creation of the Crown and various councils. Hence, we've invited representatives of some of those three voices who signed the treaty on the 6th of Feb, 1840, to give their understanding of the treaty and how it informs and influences their current perspective. And so one more time, it is hoped that this evening will inform and enhance the public debate and equip us all to more comfortably sit around the treaty table to discuss our way forward as a society and as a community. Cool. Thumbs up if that learning intention was clear. Ka pai. Oh. And so, look, if in the middle of all this upskilling, there's an emergency where we have to evacuate, I'll be sighing a very disappointed sigh, and we'll use that disappointment to null any panic that might rise, and we'll either exit out this one here. There's an exit there, or we'll certainly be following the staff of Bay Court in their blacks and their lanyards through the door we came in, and we're aiming for that green patch of grass to keep us safe. And certainly if there isn't an emergency, yes, what our night will look like is this. Alistair Reese will share with us on the perspective of the church. Antoine Coffin will share with us a perspective of tangata whenua. The Honourable Kiritapu Allan will represent to us the perspective of the Crown. Now, following these speakers and time permitting, we're aiming to have a Q&A. And this number here that's on the board has been set up just for tonight, for you to text in your questions that you might have come with, or certainly that might arise as you're listening. So even if you'd like to jot that down in your cell phone now, in your notebook now, but it will come up again. I will state it again. Ka whai. And of course, to close, we have Sir David Moxam will offer a summary of the evening. We'll close with karakia, and you'll have a choice to either make your way safely home or linger a little longer for some tea and coffee. Cool. So that's the outline for tonight. It's now my personal honour and joy to welcome up Matua Dr. Alistair Reese. He is a farmer, a historian and public theologian who lives with his Canadian wife Jeannie on a farm orchard beside the Kaituna River in the district of Tapuika. He holds postgraduate degrees in history, tikanga Māori and theology. His research and community interests centre around reconciliation and the Treaty of Waitangi. So please will you warmly welcome with me Matua Alistair Reese.
If I was really smart, we could have called it Trick or Treaty tonight, I think. E nōre ki te atua, mā ngā rongo ki te whenua whakarapai ki ngā tangata katoa. Ko te mihi nunui e ki tō mātou e te rangi e pā he mihi whakawhetai tēnei ki a koe mō tēnei huihuinga i tēnei pō. So I'm just really grateful to our Father in Heaven for our gathering today. Ka huri atu ki ngā rārangi maunga o tēnei rohi, the different maunga of this rohi, o Ngāti Ranganui, me Naitarangi, me Ngāti Pukenga, ko tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Ki te mana whenua, e te rangatira tamate tēnā koe, mō tō tuwhera mai ki a mātou e tēnei pōne. Thank you, Tamati, for your opening for us. Ki ngā mata waka, the different waka that are amongst us, ngā tangata tiriti hoki, me ngā haue whā, kua tai mai ki kone, ki tēnei pō, ko tēnei te mihi, ke te mihi, ke te mihi, ke te mihi. So, we should have all been included one way or another in that greeting, all of us. So just take it as read. My eponymous ancestor came out from Glasgow in the 1860s. His name was Alexander Reese, and he ended up in Pahiatua and gave birth to my grandfather, who was Hec Reese. And Hec Reese became a farmer in Opotiki, and he walked off the land in the Great Depression of 1920s, and ended up being a stock man, chasing stock around the roads, and ended up being a stock buyer in Hamilton. And anyway, when he died at 99, someone spoke at his funeral and said that my grandfather, when he made a deal to buy stock, he just would put out his bony, big, strong hand and say, "It's a deal." And there was no paper, nothing was handed over, but he said his word was good enough. I'm hoping that tonight that story will be understood as to why I've said it. The other thing I need to address is that somebody asked me why the church, when we put this on, what's the church got to do with the treaty? And it's a good question. And I think that one of the reasons that people ask that question is probably because of the dearth of history that was taught in our schools. The doyen of our treaty writing amongst Pākehā is Claudia Orange. And she said these things, that basically without the church, there wouldn't have been a treaty. And so what I'm wanting to do tonight is to frame a conversation and a narrative that actually brings out a voice, not the voice of the church, because there are many voices in the church, but a voice of the church that was around at the time of the formation of the treaty. And actually it's a 100-year scope of what I'm wanting to do tonight. So buckle up, as Lillian has said. It's a bit of a ride. So there's a couple of slides of introduction that I want to make before I get into the historical narrative. In 1934, Lord Bledisloe, who was our Governor-General at the time, came into possession of the land at Waitangi, because the Waitangi, where the treaty grounds are right now, it actually had fallen into disrepair. It was an old farm. The house was in the point of ruin. And Lord Bledisloe understood this and felt that the significance of Waitangi needed to be honoured. And so he purchased the land, and they had when he handed the land over to the nation, this is what he said. He said, "Let Waitangi be to us all a tatau pounamu, a symbol of peace and unity." So somebody must have given to Bledisloe this phrase, tatau pounamu. It simply means, in Māori, it means a doorway of reconciliation. So in 1934, the ruins of the treaty grounds were raised up and offered back to the nation, and then he prayed this prayer, "O God, grant that the sacred compact then made in these waters may be faithfully and honourably kept for all times to come." So Lord Bledisloe understood something about the nature of the treaty, that it was actually a reconciliatory covenant, and he was hopeful and prayerful that it would be restored into the nation's psyche. Sir Eddie Jury in 1989 spoke these, I think, very powerful words, and I think they're important for some of us to hear. Speaking to particularly a Māori group, he said at Waitangi, he said, "We must not also forget that the treaty is not just a Bill of Rights for Māori, it's a Bill of Rights for Pākehā too. It is the treaty that gives Pākehā the right to be here. Without the treaty, there would be no lawful authority for the Pākehā presence in this part of the South Pacific. We must remember that if we are the tangata whenua, the original people, then the Pākehā are the tangata Tiriti, those who belong to the land by right of the treaty. To honour our forebears then, we as Māori must never challenge, threaten, compromise or prejudice the rights of Pākehā to be here. We cannot claim our own rights if we do not first respect those of others." So Waitangi, in his words, is a tūranga waiwai not only for Māori, but a tūranga waiwai for later settlers as well. I want to say that I believe that Waitangi is not just a place of standing for Pākehā, but for all who come into the land, who enter in through the metaphorical gate of Waitangi. I've invited some tertiary students here tonight, so I thought I'd better give out some sort of solid academic definition as well. And this is my view of the treaty. So I'm upfront about, this is not an apologetic for the church, it's an apologetic for the treaty, and I'm using the voice of the church, hopefully, to shed light on the treaty. That's all it is. It's simply to understand something of the language of the times through one of the signatories of the treaty, to actually illuminate for us as we all together seek to grapple with this complex issue within our land. So I've written that the treaty is a divinely inspired reconciliatory covenant, a tatau pounamu. It's a social ordering mechanism. It acknowledges and protects the prior rights of tangata whenua. It facilitates a just entry into the land for tangata Tiriti and lays the foundation for a moral nation. The treaty covenant is analogous to a marriage between tangata whenua and tangata Tiriti, a protocol which carries concomitant rights and responsibilities, enabling two independent peoples to coexist as one. So you can write that down if you like. So here we go. So this is a kind of an historical overview, and it's very overviewish and lacking some nuance, but I offer it to you just to as one of the views that we can have. So in the early 19th century, what was the context within this scope of the lands that we're talking about in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom? We have some groups that were, I would characterised as being the adventurers, the sealers, the whalers, the entrepreneurs. We had another group that was epitomised by the New Zealand Company, and they were the ones that were here on an organised crusade, I might use the words, to actually buy land and to settle the country. There was the church in the presence and the personages of the missionaries. There was the British Crown and, of course, Māori. So one of the results of this, of the presence of the entrepreneurs, the adventurers, was the big development up in Russell, Karakia, which became called the hellhole of the Pacific. It was where the devil plays his games. It's where syphilis broke out, drunkenness, fighting, etc., etc. It was a place of anarchy as these sealers and whalers were developing their foothold in this land. One of the other big movers and shakers in Aotearoa was this man called Edward Gibbon Wakefield, and he was the one who systematically organised a colonising movement, and he had great ambitions to colonise New Zealand and to provide land for people like my ancestors who were back in the UK and who were desirous and hungry for this land. So they were, two of the competing interests of the time. It created some major problems, particularly the problems for Māori. So we had this group of Europeans who were coming in, lawless, who were seeking land and who really had no respect for the status quo, and they caused great upheaval at the time. So lots of toing and froing between Māori, northern Māori chiefs, back to the Crown in England. And the Crown was charged with this responsibility, or this challenge was how to satisfy the Māori demands to control the British citizens while at the same time satisfying the demands of their own people. There was another really group of important people, and we need to understand some of these pressure groups that were around at the time to understand how the treaty itself was actually shaped. The group there was called the Clapham sect, or they were derogatorily called the Saints. And these were a group of evangelical humanitarians. Probably one of the most well-known was William Wilberforce. And they were a lobby group that, in a sense, was lobbying the Crown for a change of direction in the way that the Crown dealt with Indigenous people, and also the way that the Crown dealt with immigration or emigration. As a result of the formation of the Clapham sect, one of the missionary groups that formed out of that was the Church Missionary Society, or the CMS. And the Church Missionary Society has been called by some historians the local proxy for the British Crown, because the CMS were one of the main groups that settled up in the north, up around Paihia. They created a community opposite Karakia, opposite Russell. That was the heaven in contrast to hell. One of the things that occupied their activities in the early years was peacemaking, and this is one of my favourite paintings or engravings in the country, and this is Henry Williams on the karere as he sails into Tauranga Moana alongside different Ngāpuhi Wakataua who come down here in 1832. But this just gives you an idea of the relationship that the missionaries, the CMS missionaries in particular, formed with Northern Māori. And so they became a mediator, liaison people, particularly for Māori, as Māori were contesting and contending with that influx of other type of settlers that I referred to before. One of the other important personages was this man, Sir James Stephen. Sir James Stephen was of the family that was involved with the Clapham sect, so he too could be called an evangelical humanitarian. Prior to his appointment as an Under-Secretary in the Colonial Office, he was involved in the Caribbean in addressing the issue of slavery. So he worked with his uncle, William Wilberforce, and in the slavery business. And then to fight against slavery. And he ended up being in the Colonial Office, and it was his responsibility to shape the policy for the Crown around immigration and colonisation. One of the things that Sir James wrote to categorise his work was this. He said, "When I look on the last 24 years of my life, all of which have passed in the Colonial Office, I cannot but be thankful for the innumerable opportunities which have been afforded me of contributing to the mitigation, if not the prevention, of the cruel wrongs which our country has inflicted on so large a portion of the human race. So, and the other thing is that Sir James Stephen was in a metaphorical battle with the New Zealand Company and seeing and opposing their ambitions for unmitigated colonisation and immigration to this land. So they were faced, the Crown were faced in England with negotiate these competing interests. The competing interests of the people who were wanting land, who wanted to settle, who didn't really consider highly tangata whenua in terms of their status as a people. I would say there were two major steps that the Crown took, and this was Stephen and others were involved in creating. The first one was in 1835, He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, and that was negotiated in 1835, and when they sent out their first representative, James Busby. Not only did they send out a representative in 1835, they also created a new flag, but recognised, most importantly, the sovereign New Zealand or Aotearoa as a sovereign entity, and they recognised the sovereignty of Māori chiefs. The other thing was of course, was the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. So the Colonial Office was fighting this battle and shaping and forming the policy that undergirds the Treaty of Waitangi. And as I've intimated, is that the Colonial Office under Sir James Stephen had quite a strong change of direction to former colonising practices and also a resistance to unfettered colonisation. So Sir James Stephen and Normanby shaped these instructions, and they gave these instructions to the future governor or first governor of New Zealand, Hobson. I'll read it out because I think it's important to encapsulate something of the ethos of the treaty. Her Majesty's Government have resolved to authorise you to meet with the Aborigines of New Zealand for the recognition of Her Majesty's sovereign authority over the whole or any part of those islands which they may be willing to place under Her Majesty's dominion. All dealings with the natives for their lands must be conducted on the same principles of sincerity, justice and good faith as must govern your transactions with them for the recognition of Her Majesty's sovereignty in the islands. Nor is this all. They must not be permitted to enter into any contracts in which they might be ignorant and unintentional authors of injuries to themselves. So the main thrust of Stephen and the others in the Colonial Office at that time was to protect the interests of Māori while at the same time facilitating a just entry for the new settlers to come in. So if we turn to Waitangi, Hobson arrives from Sydney. He's been given these instructions from Normanby, and he has to form actually the words of the treaty. He shapes the treaty over a few days as he's coming from Sydney to Paihia, to Russell. When he arrives here, he enlists the help of Busby, the British resident, and also, most importantly, he enlists the help of Henry Williams, who was the head of the Church Missionary Society at the time, and his son Edward, who were fluent in Māori. But not only was it the fact that they were fluent in Māori, it was they that actually had the relationship with Māori. CMS, the Church Missionary Society, had formed it over many years, as I'd indicated before, through the peacemaking process, etc. So we have this man, Henry Williams, who has been quite vilified, actually, over the years, particularly in 1975 by Kathy Ross, who basically said that he was deceptive in his English translation and that he mistranslated the English mistranslated the Māori in order to enlist Māori support Fortunately, there's been new research since then. A beautiful new work has been undertaken by Ned Fletcher. It's a book about that thick, actually, and so after you've read that, we can have some more conversations around the English treaty. But in short, just to say that I think that out of some of this research, that Williams's reputation has been enhanced and restored. Long kōrero, that one. What were the contributions of Henry Williams? Well, first of all, he was the mediator that actually was able to bring together rangatira. He was the one who also, when the day of the 5th and the 6th came, when Hobson was presenting the treaty, it was him who, having translated the treaty, stood before the 500 Māori and explained to them in Māori what it was all about, and all the backwards and forwards, the answering the questions. He basically represented the Crown in terms of the Crown's view of what was happening on that day. In terms of some of the micro things that he did, of course, and some of the contentious issues were around the translation of sovereignty by kawanatanga, and the translation, the full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands as tino rangateratanga. I hope you've all got your treaty sheets there. They were printed all for you, so you can go home and do your homework on that, compare these treaties. I think, these words. Another one we could do later on is actually go into some of the micro detail of these words. That would be fun too. But probably one of the most important things that I want to bring tonight, and probably the one that I want to leave with you, is the idea that Henry Williams was able to convey to Ngā Puhi that the treaty was covenantal. It was an oate. It was an oath. It was not something that was just a flippant political treatise, but it was actually something that was tapu. It was something that was deep. It's not commonly understood, but what happened was that after the first day of the 5th, when the treaty was being explained to rangatira, Hobson went back to the boat, and the different rangatira, they convened to a place called Te Tau Rangatira, which is beside the marae of Te Ti there. And they had wānanga through the night. Now, Henry Williams actually wānanga'd with them. He was in that place, and he further was processing with rangatira about what's this treaty all about. Because there was a lot of argy-bargy. I mean, if you read the to's and froing, there were people who were absolutely, indignant about this proposition that had been handed to them. He said, "I told them all to listen with care, explaining clause by clause to the chiefs, giving them caution not to be in a hurry, but telling them that we, the missionaries, fully approved of the treaty, that it was an act of love towards them on the part of the Queen, who desired to secure them their property rights and their privileges." As I said, there was a lot of argy-bargy. There was a lot of people, rangatira, who were in opposition. But one of the main speakers of the day, and the one who actually signed his name at the top of the treaty, was Hone Heke. And he says, "Remain, Governor, a father for us. This, my friends, is a good thing. It is even as the word of God." So what Heke was saying was comparing the tapu nature of Te Paipera Tapu and the treaty, saying that these are they are the same essence. They are sacred things. Now, I must not forget, at that time too, just before the signing, Bishop Pompallier stands and he says, "Hui, what about us? What about us Catholics?" Hey, katarika, no mai, hare mai. So he was basically saying, are we going to be able to worship and conduct ourselves as well here? And there was a bit of a kōrero out the back, and Henry Williams and Hobson had a talk, and in the end, they actually presented a written document, read it out to the rangatira, which essentially not only protected the Roman Catholicism, but it protected all the faiths and Ritinga Māori as well. So the Māori belief. And so just on that passage, we've got a petition going at the moment, actually, my friend Patrick here, and the late Huikakahu Kawe, which is calling for the recognition of the oral agreement as part of the Tiriti of Waitangi. So that was the last sort of statement, really. There was, and then they were invited to come up and to sign, and Heki led the way and signed at the top there. Actually, his cousin Kaweti actually come in later and put his name at the top a few days later. But and then we come down to this really interesting point, and this is where I want to put in some theological concepts in here. One of the things I think we need to understand is that these things weren't done in a vacuum. Treaties weren't vacuous. They were actually created within a worldview or a context. And the worldview of the time, as I've been trying to explain, was very much shaped in the treaty language by these evangelical humanitarians. And so the Māori, for example, that Williams used is called missionary Māori, rangatiratanga, kawanatanga, itamia. So we're all very familiar with the statement of William Hobson when they came up to sign it, and he said, "He iwi tahi tātou." And that's been variously interpreted and variously used. One of the things that I think is difficult for us to understand when he said, "We are one," what does he mean? Oh, my late friend Huikaka, who says, "Yeah, we are one, but who's one?" But actually, where did he get this statement from? I'm postulating here, but he was given this statement, "Hei iwi tahi tātou." He wasn't a Māori speaker. Henry Williams was his go-to. This was a covenantal union. He understood something about the nature of covenant. It's a paipera tapu thing. And so he was borrowing quite possibly the understanding that in the covenant, two autonomous, independent peoples, and there's a couple of good examples in Ephesians talking about the coming together of the joining of the Jews and the Gentiles. There's another one in the marriage covenant as well, between the two partners in the marriage. They retain their integrity, their autonomy, but they become a one. This is the type of oneness, I believe, that William Hobson was talking. Not a homogeneous oneness, but actually a plurality of oneness that brings together two independent people into a unity of one nation. One of the eyewitnesses said Hobson pointed out the necessity which existed for the British government to interfere for the Māori protection on account of the number of white people who had taken up abode in this country, throwing themselves on her victorious protection, but retaining full power over their people. There was another very interesting leader, rangatira from Te Rarawa. His name was Nōpera Panikariao. He was actually an evangelist as well as being a leading rangatira. And the night before the signing of the treaty up in Kaitaia, it's recorded in William Pake's diary, one of the missionaries, that they had an all-night wānanga with Panikariao around the meaning of sovereignty. Panikariao was deeply disturbed around this issue of sovereignty. What does it mean that we're giving some sovereignty to the Queen? What does that actually talk about? And the next morning, when they gathered together the chiefs in Kaitaia, he made this very famous statement. He says that the shadow of the land will go to the Queen, but the substance will remain with us. And one of the things I want to postulate again is that being a lay preacher and an evangelist, he was actually using biblical metaphorical language as well, talking about a shadow. And we're talking about the comparison of the heavenly authority to the earthly authority. And what Panikariao was actually comparing was that the Queen's authority was but a shadow, a reflection of the rangatira authority within the land. Moving forward, 1840, this idea of the covenant was actually picked up by the Crown. And the Native Secretary, Donald McLean, at the gathering together at Kohimarama, that was a calling together of different hapuas because of the Crown concern with the kingitanga, he addressed the people that were gathered there, and he called it the Tiriti. Actually, as opposed to the treaty, he called it the kawanata. So the Crown historically has referred to the treaty as the Crown as well. One of my favourite prophetic voices of the time was this man, Te Ruki Kawiti, that I was talking about before, who actually sneakily put his signature at the top of Hekes. He says, "My illustrious warriors and people, I fought with God last night, but I survived. Therefore I call upon you to trample anger upon your feet." Talking to his people, he said, "Hold fast to your faith, for the day will come when you will be ruled over by your Pākehā friends. Be patient. Wait until the sandfly nips the pages of the document." The sandfly was a metaphor for Pākehā. "The sacred covenant. Then and only then shall you arise and question and oppose, lest you break the sacred word of your ancestors, the covenant. Look to the distant horizon of the sea." So what Kawiti is advising his people is saying, let us not be the ones who break the covenant. Let the Pākehā be the ones who break the covenant, and then we can arise. 1850, and then of course we move into the 1860s, what we call the land wars and the confiscations and the demise and the loss of Māori land. This land that had been promised under Article 2 to be held, we see in that first map there in 1860, just 20 years after the signing of the treaty, how much land was left for Māori 100 years later in the North Island in this bottom. The white represents the control that mana whenua had over land. In the South Island, it was all over by the shouting within a few years. Complicated issues, but at the end of the day, Article 2 of the treaty, which guaranteed the protection of the lands, came to nothing, with over 90% of Māori land lost in terms of their control. Tangata whenua without the whenua. So this is 1860. Where's the treaty sitting around these times? How much is the treaty represented in the national dialogue? By 1877, Chief Justice Prendergast called it a worthless thing and a simple nullity. So within much of the population, the treaty had simply become, as the prophecies had said, something that had become worthless. However, the prophetic voice stood. Many remained, Mere Rikiriki, the auntie of Wiremu Ratana, who mentored him and exhorted him into understanding and taking hold of the treaty. We had this man who came forward and motivated many Māori into engaging politically. He says, in one of my hands is the Bible, and the other, the treaty. If the spiritual is taken care of, the natural will be fine. So even though the treaty had become a nullity to many, the church was mainly silent in this area. The church was not standing and representing as it had in the 1840s. But Māori, amongst their own people, continued to hold the treaty as a taonga, as a treasure, and as a tapu thing. I mentioned in 1934, Lord Bledisloe restored the Waitangi lands to the nation. And then in 1940, Te Aparanganata opened the Wharirunanga, and the whole nation came together. And slowly, the Treaty of Waitangi, in its place, and not only geographically, but as a covenantal treasure within the land, came to be restored. I think probably the most significant legislative occasion was in 1975 with the Treaty of Waitangi Act, and then the reconfiguration of that in 1985, the creation of the Waitangi Tribunal. And one of the members of the Waitangi Tribunal was Bishop Manuhuia Bennett, who said, "The treaty is a sacred covenant entered into by the Crown and Māori, based on the promises of two people to take the best possible care they can of each other. Both parties have a common moral duty to abide by the Christian and traditional Māori values it embodies." I want to finish by a speech by a man called Whakahuhui Verko. He was invited in 1990 to speak before the Queen in her last visit to Waitangi and to represent something of his views of the treaty. Many thought that he would be a patsy for the Crown, but he was a bit like Martin Luther King, and he just came up with this extemporaneous speech, which I believe, even though it's many years ago, still stands the test of time. And in closing, I want to read this speech to you. He stood before the Queen, the Prime Minister, and the assembled guests at Waitangi, and he said, I want to quote from Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. It is much more expressive in Māori, and I take liberties with the scripture. I te tahi o ngā wahi o Waitangi noho ana tātou I reira. E tangi ana tātou ka mahara ki a hiro. By the waters of Waitangi, which means the weeping waters, we sat down and we cried when we remembered Zion. Some of us, he said, have come here to celebrate, some to commemorate, some to commiserate, but some to remember what happened on this sacred ground. We have come to this sacred ground because our tupuna left us this ground 150 years ago. A compact was signed, a covenant was made between two people, a unique and unusual circumstance. But since the signing of that treaty 150 years ago, I want to remind our partner that you have marginalised us. You have not honoured the treaty. In fact, we have not honoured each other in the promises that we have made in this sacred ground. Since 1840, the partner that has been marginalised is me. The language is yours, the custom is yours, the media by which we tell the whole world is yours. What I came here for is to renew the ties that made us a nation in 1840. I don't want to debate the treaty. I don't want to renegotiate the treaty. I want the treaty to stand firmly as the unity, the means by which we are one nation. As I remember the songs of our land, as I remember the history of our land, I weep here on the shores of the Bay of Islands. May God grant us the courage to be honest with one another, to be sincere with one another, and above all, to love one another in the strength of God. So I come to the waters of Waitangi to weep for what could have been a unique document in the history of the world of Indigenous people with the Pākehā, and I still have the hope we can do it. Let us sit and listen to one another. Ngā mihi.
Tēnā rau atu matua, Alistair. Thank you. 3 times thank you for your mahi and for sharing what you've shared with us tonight. Awesome. Hey, let's do a quick shoulder roll, because we're in for another incredible speaker. How grateful we are to have Antoine Coffin, who is from Waitangi, Ngāti Ranginui and Ngāti Raukawa. He is also a descendant of French and American settlers. Antoine was the chief negotiator for Ngāti Ranginui with the Crown in their Waitangi settlement process. He is an RMA hearing commissioner and a cultural heritage expert for large infrastructure and urban development projects. Antoine lives here in Tauranga, so will you please welcome him with me? Thank you. Please come, Antoine.
Kia ora mai tātou. Tutahi māku I mani ana kia koe tarangatira. E te tōhunga te menata mo tēnei pō I whakawātia I nei o ngā kōrero I tēnei pō. E mihi kawana, e tautoko ana ngā mihi whakatau kia mātou e huihu mai nei I raro te tūnui o tēnei o whare no reira tēnā koe tēnā tātou. Hey, kia ora everybody. My goodness, that was fantastic. I was just sitting there going, yes, yes, yes. I agree with what he said. The introductions was interesting. Geez, what a wonderful education you've had, and also how you've been able to share that knowledge with us this evening and with others. And I was thinking, as you were being introduced, I was thinking, what's my claim to fame? Well, I went to Greaton Primary School. I was raised by my grandparents in a little village called Greaton. It was customary, certainly when I was born, for the eldest grandchild to be brought up by their grandparents. I used to think for a very large part of my life that was a curse, because my job was to look after all my cousins. And so when everyone was at the weddings, when everyone was at the birthdays, when everyone was at all those functions, I was at the homestead in Greaton looking after my baby cousins. I didn't realise until I got a little bit older, when I became an adult, that actually that was a privilege, that I'd actually spent, out of all my cousins, the most amount of time with my grandparents, and got to sit under the table and listen to them speak in te reo Māori, talk about how they grew up as children in the 1920s, 1930s, and the life living on Matakana Island. And so now I reflect back and think, geez, what a wonderful privilege that I had with my grandparents, and I have a wonderful relationship with my cousins who are now adults and having families. We're like brothers and sisters, as you should be. Thanks very much for coming along this evening. I'm really taken by the number of people who have come along to listen to Reese and myself and Kitty. As it turns out, that Kitty's my cousin, and we were sitting on a plane a few weeks ago saying, geez, we're going to do this talk in a few weeks. And I'm representing Ngāti Ranginui, and she's representing the Crown, and we're cousins. Cousins in the Māori sense and cousins in the Pākehā sense. Our shared ancestors are the Burrells. And for those who know the Waitangi River, our ancestors used to build ships down there. And those were the ships to take potatoes and wheat and the occasional bit of tobacco up to Auckland and across to Sydney and other places. But we're also related on our Māori side, from the Waka Tainui, from the Waka Takitimu and the Waka Mātātua as well. So we have all of these connections, complicated and sophisticated, but at the end of the day, we're cousins. She said, what am I going to talk about? And I said, I'm not quite sure yet. But apparently we're supposed to be talking about co-governance and other topical issues of the day. Well, I'm not really going to talk about those things. I probably wanted to start, this is a Ronald Reagan speech. Before I say something, I first like to say something. I wanted to perhaps focus on three things this evening, and I'm looking forward to the questions that we might get asked a little bit later. The first one is perhaps it's a reminder, perhaps it's something new to everyone, that Maunga Tapu is our home of Ti Tiriti or Waitangi. Just down the road there on the edge of the waters in Tauranga, that's where the treaty was signed here. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. The other thing is that certainly in my, and again, this is the qualifier with the asterisks, this isn't the Ngāti Ranginui view, and it might not even be the Māori view, but it's my view, and I'm owning it, warts and all. But certainly, for me, there's two things in play when we're talking about Ti Tiriti or Waitangi as a framework, but we're also talking about all of those values, all of that knowledge that we bring to the table as people, all those ancestral knowledge. And I'm talking about our indigeneity, what we bring to the table, which is really, really important. And sometimes it's easy to get lost in the academia, the intelligentsia of Ti Tiriti of Waitangi as a covenant, which is really important, but also that those bodies of knowledge and the emotions that we bring as human beings to the party, those also need to be considered. I'm also going to talk about some of the reflections on some of my work. I often get told off by my uncles and aunties, we haven't seen you, which is one, is a term of endearment, we'd like to see you more. And two, it's a bit of a telling off. You've been spending way too much time down in that place down in Wellington, and you should be spending more time here. So that's on my to-do list, spend more time at home. So I'm just going to share some of my reflections of being exposed to a number of experts from around the country, talking about diverse views about what Ti Tiriti might look like in the future. Some of those I agree with and don't agree with, but those are the views I've been hearing, so I'm happy to share some of those with you. Mine works. Yes, I belong to Ngaitarangi, Ngāti Ranginui, Raukawa and Ngāpuhi, and I just want to focus just for a little moment on the last one. My father has always been a very proud Pākehā man. He's fought for New Zealand overseas. He was in the services for 17 years. Many of his friends died in combat, and he always said to us, he was a very proud Pākehā New Zealander, and there were no Māori skeletons in his closet. And so one of the things I love doing is doing genealogical research, which I'm sure many of you do too as well. And I found out that his great-grandfather had married a Māori girl from Ngāwha. Belongs to the Cassidy family, and anyone who knows the North and the Cassidy family, they're called the Cowboys. A little rough on the edges. And so when I've been having hui up north and the whānau up there were saying, "Oh, are you sure you're not connected to Ngāpu?" And I always said, no, we've got no connections. We're still in a state of war. There has been no actual, there's been no tatou pounamu, there's been no covenant, there's been no peacemaking. We're still effectively at war. It's a little bit like North Korea and South Korea. And until most recently when I was able to confirm this genealogical link through my father's great-grandfather, and I caught up with Sam Napia, he's the CEO for Ngāpuhi, and he goes, "Anton, I look forward to receiving your registration form for Ngāpuhi." Anyway, I had to go and do a negotiation first with my wife, who's from Te Arawa. And so any people who know the history of Te Arawa, there has always been a healthy tension between Te Arawa and the northern tribes. And her father had been a very strong advocate of none of his daughters were going to marry someone from Ngāpuhi. And so he's passed away now. Certainly he passed away before we got married. And so, but I thought it was important for me and my wife to have a renegotiation. I said to her, I'm actually going to register myself and the children as descendants of Ngāpuhi. How do you feel about that? Silence. For those who, well, you would know, the silent treatment. It was just for 24 hours, so that's pretty good in the big scheme of things. And she said, yes, we have to acknowledge all those parts of us. The good, the bad, the ugly, all those parts of us. We cannot be anybody else but ourselves and the descendants of our ancestors. And so she actually taught me something about accepting who you are and being really proud of it. So I sent off my application. Interestingly, it was on a Sunday afternoon, and I thought, well, there'd be no one in the office. 15 minutes later, I got a text from Sam saying, "Thank you very much." Monday morning, he rang me and said, "Can we ask a favour, please?" And I was quickly reminded that when you become a member of a tribe, there's a reciprocity at play. It's not about getting the scholarships for your kids, it's also about giving back to the community. Just a little bit of an update. Yes, I'm a descendant of American and French settlers, but also German settlers as well. A young girl at the age of 12 came to New Zealand following the Third Civil War in what we commonly know as Prussia, Lower Saxony. So the family came here to the other side of the universe and set up shop here. Married a gentleman from America, Alexander Coffin, and had a large family, of which I'm one of those descendants, hence the Coffin name, from Nantucket Island, if you're wondering. And there's a poem, but I'm not going to recite it here this evening. In terms of giving back, certainly, and many in the room who've worked for the iwi, there's a strong sense of obligation and responsibility to not just to give back, but to be involved and to share your skills. And Kitty will know this as well. And so I've had both a privilege and an honour to be in positions of responsibility as the chair of our Treaty Settlements for Ngāti Ranginui, both for the fisheries and for our land claims, and the chair of our trust that was established in our asset holding company and a number of other trusts. I think in Merchant of Venice they call it pound of flesh, but no blood, but there was blood on the floor. I've also been privileged to go and study, both here in Tauranga, the Polytechnic, did Environmental Sciences, Carrington Polytech, which was once a different kind of place, and then Waikato University, Auckland Business School, Victoria University, and then over to Canada for a bit, Victoria University. And it's one of those interesting things where you think you're learning something, but sometimes you're actually unlearning things. And so that I really appreciated Reese's kōrero, because I'm learning things and unlearning things as well. I had a classical education in Auckland when my grandparents thought it'd be good for me to have a good Pākehā education, so they sent me to Takapuna grammar, called Takapuna grammar in those days. And so I was in the last cohort that learnt French, German, Greek and Latin. And I thought, what the heck am I learning this stuff for? In my later career, I realised, my goodness, I should have paid more attention to Latin because of all the scientific names being used for plants and flora and fauna. And I've had a very eclectic career, working for my people here in humble beginnings out at Waitangi, doing research for the Waitangi Tribunal, working for Heritage New Zealand and travelling the country with old, I was about to say old people, with kaumātua, guiding me, taking me for cup of teas. Oh, I'll tell you the story. I was with Te Aue Davis, she was a wonderful kuia from Waikato, or Maniapoto, and I rang her up and said, I'm going into the Waikato for a week travelling around. She goes, I've got to come with you. And so we just did cup of teas for a whole week around. And I remember we stopped in at Ngaruwa here and we were going across this field and we sort of parked up to this house and walked in. And she goes, we're going to have a cup of tea here. And walked in. It was this sort of old-looking, modest house. Walked in and she goes, we'll just help ourselves and making a cup of tea. And said, whose house is this? And she goes, shush, just sit down. And I'm sitting there and I hear this, is that you? Yeah. This is Daisy Te Aue is going to an auntie out the back. Yeah, it's me. Oh, good. I've got a friend. Oh, friend? Yeah. Young fella. Oh, good. And then this little queer comes in and I go, I sort of jumped up, bowed, didn't know what to shoot, a little bit like Mr. Bean. And it was Dame Tatai Rangi Kahu, the Māori Queen. And Te Aue just saw me how like awkward I was and goes, sit down. And then so Tairangi Kahu says to Te Aue, hey, go and sit down. You're the host. And she makes the cup of tea and biscuits for us. And I'm having this cup of tea and biscuits, and they're just talking about the kāinga, gossip and things. And then it gets to the more serious subjects. Oh, why are you down here? Oh, we're going around. She goes, oh, have you seen Auntie so-and-so? Have you seen Uncle so-and-so? Yes, we've had cup of teas with them. And then it finally dawned on me why we were going to all of these places having cup of teas, because you need to honour and respect those people in those areas and the knowledge that they held. And so that was a wonderful unlearning and learning for me. Why did I raise that? What has that got to do with the Tiriti of Waitangi? I suppose it's building on what Reese is talking about, is acting honourably at all times and giving honour to those people who you go and meet with that share their knowledge with. I'm going off script. This can happen. Just to provide a little bit of tauranga context, and I'm really grateful for Reese providing both a national context and also a specific context for Te Tiriti, the conditions in Aotearoa leading up to the signing, during the signing and following it. I thought that was really valuable. And perhaps I'll just pick up on a few things. One is the Te Tiriti of Waitangi, which was written in Te Reo Māori, was signed between April and May in 1840 at Maungatapu. And I understand there's about 21 signatories from memory. And when you read the list, some of the names are obvious, and you've got chiefs of Ngāti He, of Ngai Tūkairangi, Ngāti Pūkenga, and Ngai Taufau and others. And some of the other names are less familiar because they're using recent Christian names. And so you can say, oh yes, you can kind of work it out. Oh yeah, they're a Catholic. Yes, they're Anglicans. And so it's quite an interesting list of people, and it gives you a little bit of a hint of what was happening at the time and the work of the missionaries. So I'm grateful, Reese, you've sort of given some of that context, and that's really important. Important too because Tauranga was currently in a state of war in 1840. We're in the middle of a 9-year war. And so Nuka Taipare, who was one of the chiefs of Ngāti He at Maungatapu, he was lamenting that he was looking around and seeing young boys, and he said, I know that those boys will never see their late teen years. They will never see adulthood and what it's like to have a family and to grow kai for your family. He knew they were going to go to war and probably die. And so that was the context of Te Tiriti signing at that time. And so many of the chiefs at that time particularly were in the context of this could be helped with the protection of. There was high trust in the missionaries in providing for some way of reconciling this war that was going on too long. I had a quick look to see, how long was the World War I again? That's about 4 years. So a 9-year war, although it's not using artillery, it's a different kind of war, there's still that attrition and that loss of hope, which I think is really important to understand and recognise. Interestingly, following the signing of the treaty, which was a precursor to the peacemaking that was made with Te Arawa in 1845, and you look to places like Otumotai and Makatu, and Reese raised the word called tatou pounamu. Sometimes that can be a metaphoric term for a greenstone door, which you pass through, and it's like a threshold. You walk from one state into another. And sometimes it can be a physical manifestation of it, like greenstone gifts that are given between people, and they have extra importance. And I understand that both cloaks and mere pounamu were given in 1845 to recognise that the fighting had stopped and will never ever start again. And that has been the case. So I think it's important to acknowledge the work of the missionaries in 1840, and also their help in facilitating the tatou pounamu, the maungarongo, the peacemaking forever and ever between Tauranga and Te Arawa at that time. I was at there's another story. I was at a hearing in regards to Te Tumu, and we had some of our relations from Ngāti Whakaue turned up, and we had my uncle, which will remain nameless, starts with Des and ends with Kahotia. Uncle Des won't mind this. We were giving evidence about a really important part to us, Te Tumu, where one of the battles where we started in 1836, and my uncle was starting to get really emotional, because he was thinking about some of the really important chiefs who died in that battle, and he was getting really worked up, and I had this really uncomfortable feeling. I think I should say something right in the middle of the hearing. We had the judge up the front, and it was all kind of formal, and I just stood up. Ati hei moriora, ai tuaka nei I runga I te rangi māre me te aroha, ko te tukanatu taku nei whakaro ki tēnei wāhanga. Kia mau, kia aita, kia matara. O te rā e tukanatu ngā mihi ki tō tātou kaihanga nāna nei te timatanga, nāna nei te whakaotinga mea katoa. E te māngai na poro te Kiritapu, whakaungia mai mātau I roto te arano paihiri chea ki te rangi mārenga wā katoa. And everyone in the room, except for me and Uncle Des, didn't know what was going on. They were just like, what's he doing? What's he talking about? And I was just saying, just acknowledging where we've come from and that we need to be really careful. And gave a prayer, the Ratana prayer, which was about always giving love, holding on to love, and being peaceful. And I reminded my uncle that we'd actually made peace. And what he was saying was actually trying to go backwards in time. So anyway, we got to a really good place. And we all walked out with our honour intact. There have been a number of milestones along the way, and appreciate Reese covering a number of those. And just to pick up on one or two others, we had when the Waitangi Tribunal, in terms of the Waitangi Act, changed some of the legislation, we were able to make claims, historical claims. And in 1985, a whānau of Tauranga Moana made a number of claims, particularly those which are from Ngāti Ranginui, around the raupatu, the confiscation of lands here on the land that we're standing on here today. And those claims were heard between, I think, about 1997. I think we started out at Te Puna at Pirirako and made our way around the Moana into the early 2000s. And that was an opportunity to be able to tell our story. And so that story is recorded. And a lot of that research has been really helpful in being able to express who we are and where we come from. And then we went into the treaty negotiations. And I'm the first to say, because I was chairman of that the claims process can be very divisive amongst ourselves. It brings out the very best and the very worst of ourselves. And so when you're in grievance mode, you're focusing on the Crown and saying it's all the Crown's fault, but it also brings out a number of demons and the ugly side of us. And so one of the reflections I've had out of that process, and particularly spending some time in Taranaki, it's really important to be kind to each other. It just seems like a very simple human thing to do, but it's really, really important when you go through those processes that are very confrontational and very hurtful. and focusing on the outcomes of those. So I've seen go through that process and come out the other end, and there's been some wonderful positives that have come out. We know much more about our ancestors and the wonderful contribution they made to Aotearoa in so many different ways. And we also recognise and acknowledge those things that we don't want to bring into the present and into the future. We leave those things behind. I'm not going to go into the details what some of those are, but we've made a conscious choice to leave some things behind, looking to the future. A couple of things that are kind of treaty related, but not quite. One was that in a place that's just across from my marae at Wairoa is a place called Port Tiriti, Port of Relief. And there was prepared a letter which set out the rules of engagement. We sometimes call them ngā turi o te riri. And one of the interesting things is not long after this letter was penned, we have the Geneva Convention, or the start of the Geneva Convention, and it's quite interesting, the correlation between those two documents. I was trying to work out in terms of how long it would take a ship to take this letter over to Europe, and the mathematics of it don't work out. But I think that the time and some of the context which Reese has provided really show you that there was a consciousness around the world of doing war in a better way, that the values that we hold as our highest should purvey all of those things, particularly and including war. And so even though this was penned in 1864, that's within the context of the work of the churches across Europe and the South Pacific, and also our people at that time, who many of the people who penned these letters had been missionary trained. So there's no accident in terms of those rules of engagement. And then most recently, we had the 2012 signing of our deed of settlement, and we had the apology from Minister, the Honourable Chris Finlayson. And I was most interested in the apology. I was less interested in how much money we were getting. Land coming back was really important, but the apology for me was really important because we needed a mental shift from grievance mode into future mode. Being able to let things go allows us to embrace the future that will be bright for our mokopuna. And so that was a heartfelt, genuine apology we had from the minister, and for any of those who attended it, I think you'd share that thought. One of the things I did, it's a little bit risky, as chair, is I asked the people, you've heard his apology, do you accept it? It could have been, nope, and I was like, okay, I've just spent 6 years for nothing. But there was a bit of a silence. E whakai ana mātou te kōrero te minata nei? Ai. And it was led by our woman, our wahine. They called out, yes. And so it's an acknowledgement of a point in time, but it's also something that we have to keep on revisiting and to say, yes, we did accept the apology. It was given with genuine meaning. That doesn't mean to say that we're immune to grievances in the future. It doesn't mean that we're immune to things that haven't gone our way. But the apology was heartfelt, and it's important to honour it. There was another letter that was sent by Rawiri Puhirake, and it was quite a provocative letter to Colonel Greer at the time. I'm not going to go into all the great details of it, but he's basically saying the land, the sky, the mountains, the hills, the water, they're all mine. And when you come into my area, you better be careful. And used to hear these words, koe used to do things, kia tupa tokwe. It's like a warning, be cautious. And so as we move into the future, just reflecting on Rawiri's letters, for us to always be cautious. Don't take things for granted. Always give honour to those who live in the land. This is my whānau. We got dressed up 1864 styles. There's a lot of sort of Celtic-looking things going on there. I should say, 19th century clothing is not comfortable. It's a bit itchy, and it doesn't quite fit in all the right places. But it was like we were trying to put ourselves in the shoes of our ancestors and then reflect back, are we being good ancestors? And you can see all our kids are all there as well. And so, when we come up in 2040, which is only in 18 years' time, a lot of those kids there will be adults, and they'll be reflecting on how we put on the clothes of our ancestors just for a day or two, and they'll be able to do the same again. I'm actually at the back there. I'm in the back row. I'm poking my tongue out, as it looks like. Yeah. The handsome guy with the tongue poking out with the short hair. Yeah. Yeah, some cuties there. I'd said earlier that I wanted to touch on Ti Tiriti, but also Indigenous worldview, and just pick out some values I think are really important that we shouldn't lose sight of. Manaakitanga, the care that you have in yourself and the care that you have in others. It was often used in hospitality when you invited a chief or someone important, or anybody who's important, to come and stay with you. Their passage to your home was made clear. They were lavished with the best kumara, the best mutton birds, and then they were sent safely on their way. That's the traditional concept of manaakitanga. And today we think about that in that we show great hospitality, but also we honour those people who come into our presence, because that leaves a lasting impression with them, and that's a really important value. The value of whanaungatanga, everybody is connected in Aotearoa, and through conversation and talking with each other, you find out that their mother was your brother's teacher at school and he was a naughty boy. That's where you get all the gossip. But that 1 degree of separation is really important in Aotearoa. So finding ways that we're connected, not only genealogically, but by place and events and things is really important. That's a New Zealand thing to do. It's quite unique. And obviously kaitiakitanga, and over time, we often think of kaitiakitanga as the ethic of stewardship. It's rooted in your connection to the land, but also looking after protection of resources, both intangible and tangible. And it's been a controversial subject because we've, from time to time, have institutions who put their hands up, like the Department of Conservation said, we're the kaitiaki of the land. And I got really upset when they did. You're not the kaitiaki, you're a guardian, but you're not the kaitiaki, because it comes with a lot of inherent responsibilities. But that's an ongoing debate and discussion. It's a tension. And we might get to a stage where we all feel like we are kaitiaki, we're acting like kaitiaki of our family, of our place, of those things around us. Mātauranga Māori is probably the most recent word for describing all of those things, our observations and our understandings of the natural world, but also of the human world. And those are things that we can, mining is probably the wrong word, those are things that we can use to influence the way that we do things in really positive and creative ways. Although we like to think of ourselves as ancient, we're a very young culture, not only as Māori in a Pacific context, but also as New Zealanders. This was one of the last places in the world to be colonised is probably not the one, settled and occupied. So that gives us permission to actually pivot and apply our learnings and ways of doing things in new ways. We're like Uncle Tamati mentioned Maui Tiki Tiki a Taranga in his karakia, and I thought, this is going to be about an hour long, this karakia. Maui is a really famous Pacific ancestor, and we have that connection to Maui here that allows us to be innovative and be a little bit tricky at times, and to do things a bit out of the box and unexpected. That's something that we've inherited as being descendants of Maui Tiki Tiki a Taranga, and also living on the fish and the waka of Maui. We've been given permission to be like Maui. Not all the time, but some of the time. Also, just wanted to touch on kawa and tikanga. One of my uncles asked me, what do you think's the difference between kawa and tikanga? And I answered in a kind of a pass the buck way, kawa is my upper jaw and tikanga is my lower jaw. And he was like, what are you talking about? I said, in a metaphoric sense. He said, that's a literal sense, isn't it? I said, no, I'm just talking in tongues. That's okay. Kawa is the natural order of things. So we can draw inspiration from the environment, and we do that all the time. And tikanga is the human ways of doing the right thing. And it's a plural. It's the right things to do. There isn't a right way of doing things. There's a number of right ways into doing things. So from a Māori perspective, you're always thinking about kawa, what's the natural order of things? And when you're doing something that's not in the natural order of things, there's a consequence, so you do it with your eyes wide open. Probably important for this particular point in time in the world. And then there's the right ways of doing things, so there's a conversation to have as human beings about what different ways we can do things. I knew I was going to get to the Ti Tiriti of Waitangi at some stage. We do revere places, and this is, for those who know this tauranga very well, the Pukehinahina Gate Pa. So every now and again we go back to these special places and we honour them, and we did this particularly so in 2014 for our anniversaries. And I think looking forward to 2040, Maunga Tapu might be a special place where we go and honour that place in lots of different and interesting ways. Te Tiriti of Waitangi, of course, there's got 3 articles, Kawanatanga, Tino Rangatiratanga, and Tiakina ngā tangata Māori, look after our Māori people, and tuka te tikanga retitahi ki ana mea o ngā tangata o ingare. And so the same rights and privileges as British citizens. It's a little bit of a scratch your head moment because we don't see ourselves as British citizens anymore. We see ourselves as citizens of Aotearoa. But it's that the feeling of belonging, your sense of connection, and that everyone gets a fair go. That's really important. And of course the principles that have been drawn out of jurisprudence in the Waitangi Tribunal. Those are all things that we can carry forward and keep on debating. I should probably mention that over the last year I've been really privileged to hear a number of speakers talk about manifestations of Te Tiriti of Waitangi. Dame Ann Salmon is one that sticks in my mind quite profoundly. She was a small group of 3 of us, and she said that she saw a future not too far away where we might not have binary choices. It's not necessarily being Māori or being Pākehā. It's not about being treaty consistent or treaty inconsistent, that people will have the capability and the capacity to work, live and operate in a number of worlds. Some of those worlds that we call a Māori world, some of those worlds we call a Pākehā world, and some of those which we call other worlds. People will be able to move seamlessly through those. And so it brings a question mark. It no longer becomes us and them. And we go back to Hobson's famous sayings, we are one people. So one people who can operate plurally in a number of different settings. That was interesting coming from her because she's not only, obviously she's Pākehā, and she's lived a long time in Gisborne, but she was spent a lot of time with kaumātua who is steeped in tikanga. And so she understood those, and she's also an academic, so she was able to articulate that. I'm not sure that everyone is able to be in that privileged position, but it was an interesting snapshot of what the future might look like for us. So what are some of those manifestations of Te Tiriti right now? Redress and reconciliation, which I mentioned, recognition of rights and interests, particularly natural resources, enabling self-determination and shared authority, and there's a question mark, what does that actually mean? It's when you don't have to make all the decisions for everybody, you actually can share that. We sometimes call that delegation or defer. Actually, that's really hard. Can you help me make that decision? Co-governance and management. I said I wasn't going to mention those, but I am. It's quite topical. I'm actually really interested in what's post-co-governance. I spent some time down on the Wanganui River, that's with a quiet H, and talking to the whānau there, and they said, we're post-co-governance. This is not a co-governance model. This is about us all working together, working through a process of collaboration and participation, trying to find a solution that's good for all of us. So they've moved into that space, not binary. It's about us sitting all together as equals, but with different perspectives. So that was a bit of an interesting unlearning for me. Participation in decision-making processes, of course, it's about inclusion, making sure more people participate, and I should do a big shout-out for we should reduce the voting age to 16. I've said it. That's about making sure there's a place for everyone to participate who wants to. People can choose not to. People might tell people not to participate, but you have that right to participate. In a small way, we need everyone who can vote to vote every 3 years. but getting them used to participating in civil society, that becomes a habit. So when they get older, that's a normal thing to do rather than something that just homeowners and mature people do. And of course, some protection of special important things. We need, as we move into a world where everything seems to be equal and nothing's important, it's important to recognise special and important things amongst people, and the way that we deliver services, the way that people are delivered their services that's fit for those people, meets their needs, is really important. One size does not actually fit all. What might be some future expressions of Ti Tiriti? More formal roles and responsibilities of rangatiratanga, mana motuhake and kaitiakitanga. We often talk about those things that we can do together, but there might be spaces where people can just get on and do things that they need to do. At place, locally, is where it matters. So seeing expressions of people's self-determination, that's not necessarily a Māori thing, that can be a New Zealand thing, that people determine what they want to have in their own neighbourhoods and they're empowered to do that. Diversity and expression, we've talked a little bit about, or Reese has raised that earlier. Intergenerational decision-making and mokopuna decision-making. People much younger than me are talking about that. They're thinking, what does 100 years from now look like in Aotearoa? Whereas we're much focused on 1 year, 3 years, 10 years. Those paradigms, they're thinking much, much longer and making those decisions that makes them good ancestors. Obviously, the processes of reconciliation and healing go on, and often they've been for communities that I represent, iwi and hapu, but it also can be much broader than that for communities who feel disempowered or isolated, particularly as we meet some of these challenges of the 21st century, like geographic poverty, social and economic inequity. Deployment of capability and capacity, there's often some talented people, and they get captured by places like Wellington. That needs to be spread. You need to spread the love and the intelligence. That needs to happen yesterday. And working on changing some of our systems. If they don't work, you shouldn't do more of them. We should change them. And perhaps just leave with two thoughts. One is around a concept called differentiated citizenship. We're not all the same. Reese touched on this. We're all different, but we can work in a really unified and joined up way that recognises all our diversity. That's hard to do. It's not an easy thing to do. If it was easy, we'd all be doing it. But it's something you need to work on. But the benefits of that are, in a historical context, we can take lessons from the past where history doesn't repeat it, but it rhymes. We have the opportunity to be able to change that paradigm. And looking forward to Maunga Tapu, April 2040. I haven't told the whānau from Maunga Tapu that it's going to be wonderful, and we're looking forward to them hosting us all in 24. But that's 18 years. There's 1840 of logistics. Kia ora. Do you know what Antoine said the other night? He said everyone's been invited to come to Maunga Tapu. And just to finish, some expressions of indigeneity, which I've mentioned before. Those are all things that can happen in the future. And I've probably gone past my time, but I just want to take time. Today is Halloween, and it's a special day on my calendar because it was when my brother was born. He passed away when he was 21. So we always have a plate on our table for him today, and this is the first time on October 31st I haven't been at home for dinner, so I wanted to, in a public way, acknowledge my brother and say a happy heavenly birthday to my bro. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Antoine. And yes, happy birthday to Michael. Ka pai. All right, it's time for me to remind us to roll our shoulders back again. And what I'm also going to do, if you've got some questions bubbling up, is I'm going to read out to you the number that we've got for tonight. And so, if you'd like it, if you're ready, it's 021 385846. I'll do that again. 021 385846. If that's a bit of you and you'd like to, ask some questions, please do, please do. But certainly for right now, we're so glad to have the Honourable Kiritapu Allan come and speak to us. She is from Ngaiterangi, aroha mai, Ngāti Ranginui and Ngāti Tūwharetoa. She studied law and politics at Victoria University, and Kiritapu is the MP for the East Coast and the current Minister of Justice, which is a portfolio that epitomises Kiri's quest for equality and justice, reflected in her life as an activist, as a lawyer, and now as a politician. Will you warmly welcome up Kiritapu with me? Iha!
Yeah, you can chuck it up if you want to put that number up, because I might use the screen. Kia ora koutou. Everybody needs to sort of stand up, have a bit of a stretch, because I need one. E too. Stretch it out. Woo. Feel free to walk out. There's enough of you on here. No. And great evening all. Ko nai tira. Hioi. Mahana ana te wharene. Kua ki ana tō tātou nei āhua mai tēnei kōrero. Hioi. Tuatahi a. Kai a koe te pāpā. Kai a koe. Kai te pai tēnā. Kai aia. Mō tana karakia e whakatūwhera tō tātou nei huihuinga o tēnei pō. Me mihi kā tika kai a koe te rangatira e te pāpā. Me korowai ana i a tātou, kai roto i tēnei ruma mai te korowai o te aroha, mai te korowai o te manaaki, mai te korowai o te atua. Hioi. Ka huri anō, ki a koutou, ngā uri o tauranga moana, kua hara mai nei ki te whakapupu ana tētahi kōrero o te pō. Ngā uri o Ngāti Ranginui, Ngaiterangi, Ngāti Pukenga, ngā mana whenua ahika o te moana nei. Kai a koutou e tiaki ana te ahi o ngā tangata o ngā whānau no konei. Me mihi ka tika kai a koutou. Yes, where to from here? I was furiously trying to write a kōrero. You know, sometimes the best kōrero come from just listening and having a bit of a tickle, and then we move into something else. One of the things that struck me about the kōrero tonight, it's three parties, the church, tangata whenua, and the crown. I've been invited tonight because of my role as a member of the crown, my capacity as the Minister of Justice. But it struck me that as our friends were speaking this evening, I fall under the category as a member of the peoples of this place, Tauranga Moana, Ngāti Ranginui, Ngaiterangi, Piriraako. Yeah. And I fall under the third category, as somebody who was born and raised and nurtured in my church, adorned by the principles enshrined in the Bible. And I want to acknowledge my pastor, who I was raised under, and many of actually the elders of my church that are in the audience tonight. My pastor was Alistair Reese as I grew up. I grew up going to a little school called Waitangi Christian School, which was on the Swiss farm, which was on Dr. Reese's farm. I grew up having baths with his daughter, Naomi, who married my cousin, Koro. I see within the group here tonight my first ever primary school teacher, Mrs. Ives, Trish Ives, who taught at our very small school, Waitangi Christian School. I think we had anywhere between sort of 30 and 60 kids at any one time. I think the Hunters were living at one stage in the house across the road. My pastor was my elders were the Charringtons. I lived with Clyde. Anyway, that was the first whānau that raised and nurtured me. I turn to this second line here in the group tonight. My aunties and my uncles from Te Piriraco, Te Puna, many of whom were raised in the Mount, but in Tauranga Moana Rohe, and many of whom have gone home to reside in the Ukaipo, in the place that nurtured their mother, in Tauranga Moana Piriraco in Paparoa. And I acknowledge you all tonight. And finally, there's not too many people that wear the tripart of caps. Being tangata whenua, member of the Crown, and a member of a hāhiao church. But I want to acknowledge my cousin at the front, and it is true, we are all related. But Shadrach Rolleston, who rightly wears all three of those portai at any given day, any given time. As one of our commissioners for Tauranga District, I just want to acknowledge you, my cousin, for the mahi that you do for our people of this region, all of our people of this region, and the faith and the love and just the blood, sweat and tears that you pour into this place. Me mihi anō ka tika kei a koe e te rangatira. Before I kind of commence my remarks proper, I want to acknowledge that there are many leaders in this room from many different walks of life. To our current councillors of the Western Bay of Plenty District Council, Margaret Murray-Beng and John Scrimmager, just acknowledge you both for your re-selection and re-election recently. Our former Mayor, Judy, who has held a really hard ball. I think while she was in Mayor Training School or whatever it was in 2019, a day or two into that, we had the Whakaari eruption. And as a brand new Mayor, she had to steward us through some of the hardest times in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. Acknowledging too that there are previous councillors from across the many district councils and regional councils in our region. Want to acknowledge you, Sir Moxam. I look forward to your contributions that you'll make at the end of the night. I want to acknowledge the role of the Anglican Church, though, and being a bit of a steward and a bastion for having these hard conversations. I remember my time back, and I'll turn to this in a little more detail, but it was the time around the seabed and foreshore. The church played a really critical role, and it wasn't just the Anglican Church, but it was the Anglican Church, it was the Catholics. They came together as a multiple kind of hahi to steer us through spiritually, but also through some of these historical, I wouldn't call them relics, but to remind us of our collective history. So I am looking forward to your contributions this evening, because the church indeed plays a fundamental role in the evolution of our nation. I want to acknowledge the former leader of the National and ACT parties, Sir Don Brash, here as well. And, you know, some of the things I touch on will in turn touch on some of the things that you have touched on in the years. And I want to acknowledge you as we go through and make my contributions this evening. Hioi. Let's go. Well, you know, it's a funny thing when you grow up. I call myself a bit of a mongrel, right? I am. I was born to one of the youngest of a tribe of 11, of a mother who was this beautiful Piriraco woman. Her name was Kiritapu. Kiritapu Burrell she was, and that's my relation. As you heard, the Burrell hononga, we come from France, so my whakapapa goes back to France. They are the second team that I always support when it comes to any sporting contribution, so I'm going to be torn this weekend when the Black Ferns play France, but you know, either which way she'll be a winner. So, you know, actually, our little tribe here in Kiritapu, we've got a bit of an interesting, my particular family's relationship to our whenua. We've got an interesting kind of hononga there. What happened for my family from the line I descend down is that my grandmother, Roha, there was a war going on where she was from, Ngāti Apakura. There's a war going on. She met one of the gentlemen from who was in the fighting in the troops. After the war, he was allocated some land. It was confiscated land, and that was in the area of Te Puna. That land was confiscated from the peoples of Te Piriraku. That is a part of my hononga to the place that we're from. A few generations down, we married into that land, so we whakapapa to that whenua, but we also have this colonial kind of incursion that came, that birthed us. And that's one of the historical mamae and conflicts that we as a people, we are, of Tauranga Moana, we are peoples of raupatu. We are raupatu peoples. Our land was confiscated during the period of the 1860s. Prior to my life as a politician, I spent a lot of time as a lawyer and a public lawyer doing stuff like... Long story short is that I spent a lot of time doing a lot of looking at our historical background and narratives and how we came to be. I also walked a lot of the land, working with a lot of tribes up and down, and I always noticed that there's a particular type of trauma that sits with raupatu tribes. I look to Taranaki, I look to Waikato, I look to Tauranga Moana in particular. There's a trauma that exists when people are taken from their land. This doesn't happen in the area that I am the Member of Parliament for in Te Tiriti. A lot of the peoples weren't taken from their land. When there was an image that Alistair put up prior and sort of showed how much land loss there'd been in a particular period of time, one of the areas that is still highly proliferated of Māori land ownership is in the area I'm from. So you got Ngai Tūhoi, there's a lot of land that they still own, all the way up to Whānau Apanui, all the way through down the coast through Ngāti Porou, Tautanga Mahaki and the like. A lot of the land, so they weren't colonised in the same way. And that's neither good, bad and sad, because they'll have their own challenges. But I just want to highlight there's a particular type of trauma when people are taken from the land. It doesn't just exist for us as tangata whenua. I see that in all peoples that have been taken wrongfully, rightfully, but have had that link to their whenua for whatever reason severed. Now, should actually look at the bloomin' speech I wrote, eh? I want to talk a little bit about my nan, because I want to talk a little bit about my aunties and my uncles. And I want to talk a little bit about my aunties and my uncles, because it puts in context me. And then that puts in context some of the things I'm going to say about the way that I see the treaty playing out in a modern day context. A little bit of history, but more I'm going to look at the current context and looking forward. My nan, her name was Kiritapu, and she trotted on off to school at 5 years old. She trotted down to the Te Puna native school on first day of school. And her first day at school, she came home with a new name. She lost her name for her lifetime, Kiritapu, and it was replaced by a new name, Kitty. Kitty. Kitty became her name, and that is what she was known as by and large until she passed away. That story will be relevant to every single person that went through native schools in a particular era of time. Look, I don't think that the intent of the time of the people that held the pen in my position, that I currently hold, that held the pen in that time, had, I like to think that there was no ill intent. It probably was done with the best intent possible to help people adjust and adapt to a new way of being. But what that act done is it, for a couple of generations, severed, created another sense of severance for my grandmother, to her language, to her culture, and that was transferred to her children, who had to go through their own journeys, and that too, in some way, shape or form, transferred to us. So it's neither a sad story or a bad story, but it is just what it is. History is a beautiful thing. It's nothing that I think any party should fear. There's no shame in our history. We all are, hands up, I can't even put my hand up in this lifetime for being a saint. Goodness gracious me, let alone take the actions of my past, forebearers. History isn't about placing blame. It's about understanding how we become connected to a place and to a people. How we come together to understand how we just got here today. And one of the biggest things that I find in these conversations when we start to look back at Ti Tiriti or Waitangi, or when we start to have at this inherent time of the political cycle, these race-fueled debates, becomes this big fear-mongering. Iwi versus Kiwi, co-governance versus democracy. It upsets me so much because it's just not about those things. What it is about is understanding. Hey, yeah, how do you stand in this place? Hey, yeah, what is your history? Hey, yeah, oh, true. Hey, man, my uncle was on that farm. He sort of ran into a bit of trouble. He had to go, oh, yeah, that's right. That's when my uncle came down and blah, blah, blah. It's a way of connecting ourselves to our history, to our past, and therefore to our future. So as I grew up, I think as Dr. Reese was giving his historical overview of some of the history, and he walked us through he brought to life a number of the thoughts and the intent of the policy makers of the day at a particular time. Dr. Reese knows that history. He's a studied man. He has a doctorate in theology, in history, I think it is. He has gone in pursuit of this knowledge to understand. I had no idea about a thing called Ti Tiriti or Waitangi when I was going through school. I'm sure that for many of you tonight, some of the things that Dr. Reese alluded to might have been relatively new information. I learned a little bit after school. I went in pursuit. I hung out with a whole group of Christians who were into this stuff. We went up to Waitangi to understand a little bit of it. There's probably a little bit how Gnomes and her crew are all running at the moment. So I learned a little bit more. That was sort of interesting. It was, through opportunity. And then when I went to law school, I learned a little bit more, but particularly about the legal history of Ti Tiriti or Waitangi. I think for me, it's such a lost opportunity because there's nothing ill or bad or sad. I don't know if many of you felt the weight that couldn't be carried and just the thoughts of the people who are holding the pen at that time, what their intent was, what went on, and then what could have happened. It's not a sad story, it's not a bad story, it's just our story. And so I want to thank you for the work that you've done, Dr. Reese, in terms of just bringing to life the various strands of a story and sharing in the way that you have tonight, in terms of having the foresight to bring these conversations to life in our time. Me mihi anō ka tika kai a koe te rangatira. I'll fast forward a little bit because I think my cousin Anton has probably touched on some of the domestic context in terms of what some of the settlement issues have been here in Tauranga Moana. And my colleague, Dr. Reese, has talked about some of the history. So I'm going to just lump on into where we're at right now. What is the role of Ti Tiriti when we look at it from a governor's role? How does the executive interpret Ti Tiriti or Waitangi? And I want to take us on a little journey that will span probably the last 20 or so years in particular. I'll hopefully have let some of the legal history that Dr. Reese and others have provide a little bit of a context. So just a real quick touch base. 1835 Declaration of Independence, 1840 we had the Treaty of Waitangi. Through the 1880s we had the land wars. In the early 1860s, the Chief Judge Prendergast declared the Treaty of Waitangi a simple nullity. there was a few cases in the early 30s, well, actually throughout that period of time, that essentially reaffirmed that decision. Fast forward to the 1970s, on the back actually of what people in Aotearoa, they were looking at, there was the civil rights movements of the 60s. People were starting to see what it meant to stand up and talk about history and rights and whatnot. That had implications domestically here in Aotearoa, which led to things like the Land March. Dame Whina, some of you may remember, she walked the length of the North Island with the proclamation, not more, one more acre, which led to, ultimately, an act in 1975 called the Treaty of Waitangi Act, which sprung forth a Waitangi Tribunal. And since then, throughout the early 80s, actually throughout the 1980s, we started to see the first wave of nationalised treaty settlements. So fisheries, forestries, lands. We saw a whole range of cases come up through the higher courts, and we started to develop a New Zealand lexicon and also jurisprudence that was based on the evolution of those cases. I'm not going to delve into that too much, but I will then just go very quickly from the 1990, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When was that? Anyway, from the early 90s, that commenced the first ever, the tribal treaty settlements with Waikato Tainui and subsequently Ngaitahu. That was the start of individualised treaty settlements with tribal groups. I want to acknowledge what my whanaunga here has said. These saw the best of times and the worst of times, and more, if I can be really frank, having worked in this area for many years, those are hard times. It pits cousins against cousins because what you are doing is fighting over some scraps of cash and some scraps of money and some entities and some roles at a governance level. They aren't this huge wealth kind of proclamation that folks think they are. If you look at them in the scheme of I could look at EQC settlements down in Christchurch. It's not even a pittance of what has been the equivalent of what the EQC payouts are. But that's just to put some things into context. So now, we sort of, and as those treaty settlements evolved, things became more nuanced. It wasn't just about cash. And this is over multiple governments. And when you think this is like a Labour thing or a national thing or a thingy whatever thing, this was just a historic thing. So we had incredible leaders over the years from all political parties that saw the value in having the restoration of the wrongs done throughout many a historical accounts that have now gone through the Parliament. So it went from being strictly just a kind of a cash base, handshake, Bob's your uncle, see you later. It got a little bit more nuanced along the way. It started to include things like, hey, how do we look after this particular river? Or this particular maunga who was our ancestor? Or what about the way that the tribes of this region, we have a shared eponymous ancestor or waka or something. We want to collectively work together with the Crown to manage these things. Those types of co-management and co-governance arrangements started very early on in the piece, and they've been in New Zealand's lexicon for over 20 years. So suffice to say, when the current discussions around co-governance as being something, A, that is a creation of a contemporary time, i.e. right now, and B, that it's something new, it really kind of sent a shock. Sometimes you get shocked by some of the stuff you hear. You're just like, where has this come from? These arrangements, so Ti Tiriti or Waitangi, so Geoffrey Palmer described New Zealand's constitution one time as a hodgepodge of rules and, what did he call it? It was a hodgepodge of rules and laws mixed together. I like to refer to it as a bit of a boil-up. Not all the bones are as sweet as each other. Some have a little bit more fat, a little bit less fat. And important parts of our constitution, things like the Human Rights Act, for example, that's really important. The Bill of Rights, that's a really important part of our constitution. It's not, I don't want to, but for example, one of the constitutional conventions we've got here in Aotearoa is that the Governor-General signs off our legislation. It's a constitutional step, and it's a finalised, it's to recognise that the Queen is, the King is our sovereign, and has authority to pass those laws, but by and large now that's a convention, it's a form of practice. The real kind of authority and power is manifest within New Zealand. Ti Tiriti has been one of these things that has been described through the courts for a gazillion years, but particularly if we go back to kind of the early 80s, but as an inherent part of New Zealand's constitution. It's one of the cornerstones of the way that we, as members of the executive, of the cabinet, have to interpret the way that we give effect to and create law in New Zealand. It's been affirmed in the higher courts for decades. None of the stuff is new. To quote the former National Party Attorney General and Minister of Treaty Negotiations, the Honourable Christopher Finlayson, the horse has bolted and the skies have not fallen in. The skies have not fallen in. And one of the things that I guess one of the things I want to note about, whether it's co-governance or whatever it is that will be the topic of the day, is that the way that we engage in these discussions is so critical. I remember being that 19-year-old law student with dreadlocks flying, studying public law at the Victoria University just across from Parliament. I just scored this really neat job, licking envelopes for the Right Honourable Helen Clark. Didn't know anything about politics, but it seemed like a neat role to have. And I was studying constitutional law, public law as it was, in my second year, learning about how laws were made. That was the same year that the Ngāti Apa decision came out, 2003. And the Ngāti Apa decision, for those who don't quite recall that period of time, was the catalyst for what became known in New Zealand's history, narrative, as the seabed and the foreshore debate. I remember being a 19-year-old Māori kid from here, strutted down to Wellington knowing nothing, and still know nothing, but knew less then, and being just like absolutely shooketh. One, because I just couldn't understand that any government, and you've got to remember, so I'm not trying to be political here, this was my government that was in charge at the time. I'm talking about my former colleagues, and I've had these debates, and we have these debates. My former colleagues decided to legislate to take away the rights of Māori to appeal through a court system to determine whether or not somebody had customary rights to a piece of land. They wanted to do some aquaculture developments. Now, what surrounded that and what led to the largest probably protest indeed of my lifetime, or of my lifetime that I remember, was the seabed and foreshore hikoi. It mobilised around about 40,000 people over a period of a couple of months. But the issue that cut deep, that was one, like how could you just erode these constitutional principles? And I know others here will say, yeah, but Parliament is supreme and there's parliamentary sovereignty, therefore it wasn't unconstitutional. I get that, but the threshold to take away somebody's right to appeal in court just because the scaremongering at the time was that these Maoris are going to take away your right to have picnics on the beach. And I remember being one of those Maoris going, are we going to take away people's rights to have a picnic on the beach? Why would we do that? I want to talk personally about how that made me feel as a 19-year-old law student in a class of 250 law students, being propelled by this narrative that Māoris were going to divide our nation. It felt humiliating. I was traumatized. All my colleagues, we felt so embarrassed to go to school. We knew that every single day somebody was going to say, these Maoris are going to take away your rights. It was dominant, it was predominant. People would stand up and be proud to say what our people were going to do. Fast forward 20 odd years later, we had a few reversals of the laws, and in my mind that whole debacle was a huge, well, one, it was just so sad for New Zealand's race relations, I think. Two, it emboldened and it enabled racism in a way that no kid from Aotearoa should ever have to experience or feel in a modern day democracy that should not be tolerated. But three, it created just really bad law. Dogma and, these kinds of debates that they fuel bad outcomes, bad policy decisions, and ultimately we make bad law. We spend a lot of money and a lot of time having to fix bad law, and as a consequence of that bad law, more bad law was introduced, and now we are just at the start, 20-something years later, we are just at the start of commencing the determination of those customary rights through a high court process, and that's going to take a really long time. Ultimately, a really bad outcome for New Zealand. We can't do that again. Aotearoa, we're better than that. We're better than that. We cannot be afraid of our history. Teach our people who we are, where we're from. Teach our people about our connection to this place and each other. I mentioned that, I was born and raised in a little place called Paengaroa in a loving, nurturing church community. I lived in old Clyde's horse truck in Pongakawa for a bit, If it doesn't matter who we are or where we're from. If we have genuine relationships and connections, we can honour each other, we can respect each other. We are better than this, Aotearoa. The discussions that will inevitably come very soon, and they are here right now on our doorstep again, because we have a couple of political parties being bastions for that race-based rhetoric that seeks to tear us apart, co-governance, or democracy. Guess what? You can have both. Iwi or Kiwi, guess what? I'm both. All I hope and all I seek that is, as we move forward, and I can say this with somewhat authority, as a person that wears the hat of the crown, as a person that was raised in the loving arms of a pretty Pākehā church, and as a person that has whakapapa to this place in this whenua out of a genuine love for our people. We must do better. And as we engage in this next lot of debate, that will come about again. I implore every single one of us to ask a little bit more of ourselves as we engage in that debate. Unpack what drives the debate. Is it about bringing us together and making us a better nation, or is it about pitting us against each other? Aotearoa, we can be better than this. Hioi. I don't think I'll say too much more tonight. And it might sound a little bit trite. But God, man, I couldn't be prouder of our place when we're out on the international stage. You see kids do the haka for the first time and try to cling to something that's from home that they call theirs, from this little place called Aotearoa. Imagine if we felt that sense of pride every single day, regardless of our whakapapa, but because we love this place. Imagine what we could be as a nation. I believe in us. And it's because of conversations like this, Alistair, that I think that our nation can heal. I think that we can grow, and I think that we can be better. So thank you for putting this evening on tonight. Hioi, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā rau atu e te tuakana I o kupu me o whakakitinga ki mua. Thank you so much for your vision and for your articulation of that vision and passing it into our ears and hearts tonight. Tēnā rau atu. Good news, tātou. We do have time for some questions. And so before we do that, we've actually even got time to stand up and stretch. So will you do that? Will you do that? Will you say kia ora to the person next to you? Ka pai. Wriggle those hips. Wriggle those hips, roll those shoulders. All right, that'll do ya, that'll do ya. Thank you, I'll grab your attention back now. Ka pai, we've had some questions come through and I'd like to ask them. And to our speakers, I reckon between yourselves, you three, will you just volunteer? If you reckon you've got yourself an answer, please would you share your wisdom with us? Ka pai. So here we go, let's see. One question was, it is often claimed that the treaty does not specifically refer to partnership. Would it be fair to say that the parties in formalising a treaty signalled a desire to work together, which is essentially partnership? Bit of semantics around that word partnership and intention. Ka whai.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. We had a wānanga for 3 days with Ngāpuhi in Northland talking about this idea of partnership, and they were saying to us, this whole idea of partnership is foreign to us because it's about that's talking about a destination, and they said we thought we'd signed the treaty for having a journey together, which is a different way of framing it. So they said, yes, it might lead to partnership, but it might lead to other things as well, where we feel quite comfortable doing our own things so it gives us the space to do those journeys to different places, and some of those are together and some of those are apart, and some of those we're letting you know we're on a journey. If you want to come and join us, we'll be at this place at this particular time. So that's how they framed it. So, and I thought that was quite a refreshing explanation of the relationship and possibly leading to partnership.
Tēnā koe. Relationship over partnership, potentially journey. Question number 2. What relevance do you think the treaty will still have? Or the question is phrased, what relevance do you think will still exist under Ti Tiriti once all iwi have settled? Matua Alistair is giving eyes. Ka pai. Ka pai.
Oh, kia ora. No, it's a great partai. Just bearing in mind, though, that the tiriti or Waitangi isn't something that's settled. It's an ongoing relationship, it's an ongoing partnership, and it forms the base, it's a cornerstone, it's a touchstone of our constitution. Treaty settlements are a small part of the recognition, a reconciliation that harm was done by my institution, the Crown. We misacted, and therefore, in a tiny, tiny sense, are trying to make some recompense. That's an acknowledgement, and that will finish that part. It will be full and final for that tribe for that moment. But the treaty is a living part of our people, our place. We can lean into it and all feel a sense of connection, which I think is actually what this conversation is about tonight.
Tēnā nō koe. And so another question here is, how can we, being the folk in this room, how can we participate and help advance Te Tiriti visions and Te Tiriti hopes here in Tauranga? Ka pai.
Good question. I think we often contextualise Te Tiriti of Waitangi with grievance, particularly in the modern era. Treaty settlements, protests, the 2 protesters at Waitangi that were on 6 o'clock news. Behind them, the 500 people enjoying a picnic. So context is really important, and I think for us and our generation is taking the opportunities to do interesting things, some new things together, and they don't necessarily have to be bound or constrained by our history, our shared history. They can be new things that create new opportunities for us to do things together.
Kia ora no. Part of it is also responding to the who are we talking about, and we are collectively together, but we're also unique and individual. So I would speak to my fellow Pākehā people. We were talking earlier on with some friends, basically saying, I wish I had known more about this when I was younger. One of the things that I often say is that Māori have been at this table, mai rano, they've never gone away from the table, but my people, we're Johnny come lately. So one of the things that I would suggest politely is that around the barbecue, we could maybe say, what do we know about the treaty? And actually, because as we introduced tonight, one of the goals is to upskill our dialogue. And so I think around the barbecue, or even on the beach maybe, we can actually begin to upskill some of the narrative. And that's why I put some of the historical stuff. I know it's a bit 101, and and for many of you, you already know it, but there's some core stuff that we just have to know before we can actually converse and dialogue together with. It's a bit like if you want to learn a language, you just have to you have to learn some words. You can't really converse in another language until you learn the words. So that would be one of the things that I would suggest.
Any other answers from the front here? No, ka pai. Ka pai, and a closing pātai for us, closing question. What examples do we have that demonstrate unity and cohesive cooperation with the three voices in recent times? What examples do we have? Yes, please.
And I'm happy to open this up for others and examples. Something perhaps we take for granted from time to time is Anzac Day. That's an event that, even though obviously we weren't in our living generation part of that war, we commemorated it in really special ways at special places. So one of my privileges was having a leadership position at Auckland War Memorial Museum and doing the organisation for some of those events. And it was really incumbent on us, one, to recognise the military history of that, but also the sacrifices that men and women had, those who stayed home to keep the home fires burning, and those men, young men who went away never to return, and the impact that that's had on these current generations. We haven't had the benefit of the flower of that generation that gave their lives, and so that's something that's universal. It's not necessarily a Ti Tiriti or Waitangi thing, but it's about recognising there's a place for everybody and being inclusive. For me, it's the same principles. So that's one example, I think, of something we do very, very well.
Kiritapu and Matua Alistair, would either of you add an example? No?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, Kitty just reminded me. So recently, in 2018, the Anglican Church came to Tauranga Moana and apologised to Ngāi Tamarawoho and Ngāti Tapu. The talks are ongoing, and one of the things is that we've actually been cooperating with the council, with the commissioners, with the hahi, with local tangata whenua, and essentially what it is we're trying to find a reconciliatory way forward where those three parties are working together. I think so. That's a good practical example of that in action. And oh, sorry. Yeah, we've got it. It's actually sitting on Willie's table right now. We actually haven't heard from him. Oh, ka pai. Yeah. So we've asked the Crown to respond to this as well. So yeah.
Ka pai, good thing there are cousins in the house tonight. Well, now, please, as we forecasted, as we signposted, it's now time for Sir David Moxam to come and summarise and share with us his insights overall this evening. Thank you. Please come. Please welcome him. Thank you. Oh, no, ka pai.
Rangi Ngāti Rangi Nui Ngāti Pukanga, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. E ngā pā tawhito ki konei, taumata kahuai o tamataha. E tū, e tū, e tū. Tēnā kōrua, tēnā kōrua, tēnā kōrua. E ngā rauranga tira mā, ngā kuia mā, ngā tangata mā, ko tu hai mai nei e tēnei pō. Tēnā koutou, ma te atua koutou e manaki, e te minita tēnā koe, tēnā koe, tēnā koe. Mihi mai ki a hau, kua tai mai nei i tēnei pō i roto e te aroha o te atua. O reira, mihi mai, mihi mai, mihi mai. If someone was watching us this evening, and many more people will be when they see this recording, they may notice something that you wouldn't notice, probably, anywhere else in the world. It'd be interesting to show this recording this evening to somebody offshore. What would they notice? I venture to suggest they would notice 5 things about what we've seen this evening and this remarkable night. And I take as my guide Dr. Mason Jury's Whare Taparima. They would notice that each speaker referred to taha wairua, that is to say, to their spiritual side, their heart, their ngākau. All 3 of them did. Secondly, they referred to their taha hinengaru, their thought processes, their way of understanding the psychology of the world. Thirdly, they talked about their taha tinana. They embodied it in the way they spoke and moved. Fourthly, they talked about their taha whānau. They made the immediate family connections as they began to speak, and all through their speeches there was this networking, this relationality, this cohesion of humanity, team human. And interestingly, with Mason's 5th point, more recently now, taha whenua, that is to say, a relationship to the earth, to the very ground of their being. And none of their speeches this evening missed any one of those 5. Now, I put it to you this evening that you wouldn't find that, I don't think, in quite this way anywhere else in the world. In quite this way. Every culture, particularly indigenous cultures, have many elements of all of these, but in a way, a treaty-birthed nation is influenced by all these 5 things which were present in 1840 on February the 6th. There was the spiritual side, covenantal theology, as we heard. There was the thoughtful side, the partai, the questions, the debate, the robust encounter, the accountability. There was the tinana, that terribly poignant moment when a chief caught Hobson going back to the ship and said, "You're unwell." A taha whānau, they were all thinking all the time about their iwi, their whānau, their hapu, and the consequences of what they were about to do. And above all, perhaps, taha whenua, the sacredness of the land itself and what was at stake. The treaty has already begun to shape the way this nation thinks and talks and speaks. This is not a question of treaty or no treaty. This is not a question of participation, partnership, equity, rangatiratanga options. It's already happening, as you've heard. The question is, what will we now do with this treasure that has been handed to us from our past? We've dropped it, we've trampled on it at times, it's been desecrated and betrayed at times by colonization itself. But we're here this evening doing this because the treaty has given birth to something inside us that cannot be taken away. How will we let it grow? Where will it go? What will become of us under the influence of this covenant? In these 5 ways. Let me have a quick look at tauranga, which I may need a little bit of help with as I conclude these few minutes. With the clergy, hot air expands to meet the space available. So there will be a hymn and the plate will go around twice. Just saying, no tickets. Thank you. I'll leave it to you to give me the first one. This is an anti-Anglican computer. There you go. Most of you live here, you know about this. The first encounters were good. They were mutual. They cross-pollinated with productivity, fecundity, and so on. There was even mutual cohabitation in villages, a matapihi. There was this in the middle of a tragic conflict with death all around and bullets flying through the air. Hēni Te Kirikaramu found people and ministered to them at Pukehenehena. Across the mud and the blood and the chaos. Team human. Treaty spirituality, covenantal bonds which were deeper than the conflict and have survived that war this evening. And this I was told by someone from Waitangi at a council meeting a couple of years ago. This waka race in Tauranga occurred not too long after the Battle of Gate Pa. That's resilience. That's the capacity to begin to recover with all 5 taha of being human. Extraordinary achievement of the spirit. Undefeated. We've heard about the tribunal recommendations and findings and settlements in this country for Tauranga itself. You heard about the Anglican apology, an archbishop kneeling in the wet grass as he handed a formal apology to Ngaitarangi Ngāti Ranginui, to the O Tamataha Trust itself, because we were here together on good terms in 1838. And that collapsed in 1864. And we want to go to where we were again and find each other through a repentance, restorative justice act of commitment. As the Anglicans walked onto the O Tamataha Pa, just over here, the heavens opened up and we were baptized in the most incredible thunderstorm. And the wind buffeted the sides of the tent and robes were flying everywhere and bishops are getting their hair drenched, and it was very good for us. We felt a bit better after that. But the consequences of this apology in treaty terms have a long way to go. And we are committed to seeing this through to the end because we're treaty people. Tangata Tiriti, tangata whenua, bound forever in this team human enterprise in Tauranga Moana. And lastly, the school curriculum. Maybe this recording will be shown in a school. I hope it will. Maybe hundreds of school children with the curriculum next year will find their way to Tauranga Moana and learn and learn and learn and learn from what happened. Let me finish with this saying from Rangiaowhia, not, of course, Tauranga Moana, but deeply connected to the trouble and the crisis and the tragedy of 1864. This was one of the worst tragedies in the history of our country, where we were so conflicted and so desecrated by an attack on Catholic, Anglican, Ngāti Apakura, Ngāti Henatu village, that one of the descendants of the survivors, because they're a treaty-based whānau, said this: should we first know of Rangiaowhia and its full story, we will know that the partnership between Māori and British was once very promising. The weaving of the white thread, the black thread, and the red thread once created an extremely beautiful picture. And in that picture was a treaty showing complete promise. We look forward to a day where we again live in a harmonious, thriving partnership. All flowers encouraged to blossom, as did the lanes of houses and children of Rangiaowhia. All branches of the peach trees that once lined the ridges, branches connected to a common trunk that is partnership. And should a strong gust of wind approach us, we stay bound, committed to growth and to tomorrow. That's what this evening is all about.
Tēnā nō tātou, what a rich night we've had together on this fine Monday evening in Tauranga Moana. Wow, wow, wow. Will I, before I invite our matua tamati up to bless our goings and our time that was, I would love to reiterate the invitation to stay for tea and coffee. Coffee on a Monday night at this time. Oh, if you're keen, come and stay for tea and coffee afterwards, and continue on the chat. Practice upskilling our conversation, and learn how to be team human in this way. Otherwise, Paul Mārie from me and Matua Tamati, will you come and bless us again? Tēnā koe.
Hoi anō, māku me whakamutu ngā tēnehi. Hoi anō, e mihi nei ki a koutou katoa. E aku rau rangatira, nā koutou te pō, nā koutou ngā kōrero I tukuna mai mō tātou katoa. Nō re, e mihi nui ki a koutou, a ki a koe hoki e pā. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe I tēnei rā. Anei te karakia o te hahi mihingare mō tātou. E tō mātou matu nui a te rangi ki a tapua nō tuinga. Nei rā mātou hōponanga ko taumai tēnei ahi I pō tuku whakapētai ana mātou ki a koe mō ngā kaupapa I whakahaeretia mō mātou katoa. Kia tau kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiki, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga I te wairua tapu, ake, amine, kōkiri.